Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to George Croft's American Music Show. Today, we are diving into the life and career of the legendary Eddy Arnold, so stick around. Ladies and gentlemen, I have some dates coming up for you, so come on out and see me. I will be June 7th at the Barn in Gilroy, and tickets for that show are available through my Instagram bio and on my website, georgecroftmusic.com. Then June 16th, I will be at the Grass Valley Center for the Arts opening for Asleep at the Wheel, and I am so stoked about that show. And then June 20th, I will be at the R-Wagon Bar in Browns Valley, so come on out and see me. Ladies and gentlemen, this episode of the show is brought to you by the Marysville Barber Parlor at 414 4th Street in Marysville. I am an absolute snob when it comes to my barbershop experience. I like to walk in. I like there to be cool stuff on the walls, cool vibes, good conversation, usually a free beer in the fridge, and they don't charge you an arm and a leg, and they do a killer job. So it is my kind of spot. I love hanging out in there. And for a limited time, if you walk into the Marysville Barber Parlor and tell them that George Croft's Music Show sent you, you will get $10 off your first haircut. So go get yourself $10 off a killer haircut with our friends down at the Marysville. All right, Eddy Arnold. As I was diving into the research for this episode, I found Eddy Arnold to be in the same category for me as like a Marty Robbins type character, if not a little bit louder for his time. Because he doesn't seem to have any of the self-destructive bullshit that a lot of our people that we've covered in the past have had. He seems like just a hardworking dude with a good attitude. He was a gentleman. He, just was a good businessman. And he just had a immaculate voice. I mean, Eddy Arnold's voice is one of my all-time favorites in general. And he was one of the earliest to ever do it. So he's born in 1918 in Tennessee, and when he's born, both of his parents are older for having kids. I think his dad was 58 and his mom was like 47 or something. And they had both had kids from previous marriages. So his dad had 9 sons from a previous marriage, I think. And so he had those 9 half brothers, and then his mom had 2, I think they were daughters from a previous marriage. So he was one of whatever that is, 13 kids or something, or 12 kids, I guess. And, but all of his siblings were much older than him. So he didn't grow up like with that. Like by the time he was around, most of his siblings were like moved out of the house and off, doing adult things. So he describes his siblings as kind of distant relatives. And, but, pretty early on, tragedy strikes here because when he's like 11 years old, his dad dies, which, whatever that would have been. If his dad was 58 when he was born, so, 11 years later, so he's, 69, almost 70 years old, somewhere in there. And so, his dad passes away, and they had owned a family farm. Like, that's kind of how they made their living. And it does not go well pretty quick. I mean, as soon as his dad dies, like soon thereafter, the family loses the farm. But they don't just lose the farm. They kind of get this insult to injury thing added because this is in the mid 1930s. So this is like Great Depression time anyway. It was probably like, dad was probably barely keeping the farm going as it was. And then when he died, mom and the kids just couldn't make it work financially. So they lose the farm to the bank. Somehow they are almost immediately turned around into sharecropping the same property that they live on. Like, so their family farm went from being this place of sustainment for the family to this kind of evil boot that was on top of them, because we've talked about sharecropping in the past. Lots of people that we've talked about on this show had their run-ins with sharecropping. But basically, you were in this predatory lending cycle with a landowner where they front you the money, the credit for rent and for, food, but you had to pay them back out of the harvest yield, even if the yield didn't cover your part of the profits. So oftentimes it was backbreaking work and you end up in more debt than when you started. And so now they're kind of forced into this, starting on the property that they previously owned. So basically, like, the bank took their property over and then flipped it around and is like forcing them into this very predatory setup. So that doesn't last, very long. I mean, it sounds like they actually move around a little bit after this. Like, they start off on their own property, but they kind of bounce around a little bit after that. And Eddy Arnold describes that feeling as the one that inspired is probably the wrong word, but he like swore to himself that he would never be that poor again. That he wanted some power over his financial outcomes here. And so when he was 16 years old, after, growing up sharecropping, in the 6 years after his dad died, he leaves home to just support himself. Like, he decides he doesn't want his mom to have to worry about feeding him. So he goes off and gets a job, and he goes, so he leaves town. I think he goes to Jacksonville. I think Florida actually is where they ended up. And, he takes a job at a funeral home and a radio station. So he starts singing at night on the radio. His day job, he's working for the funeral home as a hearse driver and an ambulance driver. Apparently at the time, here we are in the, mid 30s, ambulances and or hearses would double function as ambulances, which is kind of nuts to think about, but okay. I mean, I guess it kind of makes sense. But anyway, so he's running around responding to emergencies and functioning as just a hearse driver going to funerals and stuff. And then at night he would go to the radio station and, sing songs. And, he started to get his local following going from his radio appearances because his voice was really good. I mean, if you go back and listen to Eddy Arnold, you can imagine, even for the technology of the time, his very clear, just deep, broad voice cuts through the airwaves pretty good. Even on, the mics and the amplifiers of the day, you could hear that he had this booming voice. And like I said, he starts to create a following here. And so I think that was 1934 is when he makes his radio debut. It's WTJS, yeah, in Jackson, Tennessee, not Florida. Okay, I think there was a Florida section in here somewhere. I think he might have bumped down there as a kid doing the sharecropping thing, but I'm not sure about that. Anyway, Jackson, Tennessee, he's the hearse driver, ambulance driver, and he's working at the radio station. And he becomes a regular. And in 1940, he joins Pee Wee King's Golden West Cowboys as a featured singer. And so he joins a band. And initially, that's great. It's getting him way more exposure. He's touring around doing things, like he's living the life of a musician. And they're doing, this is his first appearances on the Grand Ole Opry. They're doing military bases. They're doing whatever gigs they can get their hands on at the time. So it's kind of a first initial introduction into some success in the music field. And that's 40 to 42. So he spends 2 years with Pee Wee King's band. And then in 1943, he basically decides, okay, I've got to make more money than I'm currently making. Because at this point in 1943, he's taking care of his wife. And I think he had a couple of kids at the time. So he'd gotten married in the intervening years here. And I think he had 2 small kids already by 1943. So he's taking care of a wife and 2 kids and his mom, who, is getting into the later years of her life. And he's now taking care of her full time. So he decides, I got to go do the solo act thing. I got to make some more money. So he goes to Harry Stone, who Harry Stone was, he worked for WSM. He's like the radio guy running, like the Grand Ole. He was a big name in the Grand Ole Opry and, country music at the time. And Harry Stone, he was the station manager. And, Harry Stone kind of took a chance on him, and because he went to Harry Stone and said, I would like to work for you as a solo artist. Do you have anything, do you have room for me? And Harry Stone had seen his popularity in his appearances with the band in the previous couple of years. And he doesn't engage with him as an actual manager, really. Like, but he kind of gives the kid a break and he puts in a good word for him at the Victor recording company. It wasn't RCA Victor yet. It was just Victor. And, which, you know, like I said, became RCA. But, so he pitches it to Fred Forster, who was the RCA, you know, he go on to be RCA Victor. Currently, at this stage in the story, it's the Victor recording company. And this is where we get some cool overlap here, because we're in 1944. And if you guys remember from our Sister Loretta Thorpe episode talking about the V discs, which was where shellac had become scarce during World War II because it came from Southeast Asia. So, which was where all the fighting was happening. And so the supply of shellac to the United States got like cut down by like 60% or more. And we needed that for making munitions, but we also needed it for making records, because before that, all the records were made out of shellac. But that helped push us towards, when that shellac problem got started, it helped push us towards using vinyl records. And, but this moment is right in that transitional period here where like vinyl is becoming more popular, but the industry hasn't shifted to it yet fully. And here we are in 1944, and basically he records his first single, and he does it from WSM's studio. So even though he's working for Victor, he records it from WSM because the Victor company was in Chicago, I think, at the time. But he records his first kind of single there at WSM, and because he's a new artist, they only allot him 85,000 records because that's how much shellac they had. It wasn't like a normal thing to limit a new artist records in general. It was just because there was a shellac shortage. They needed most of it for the bigger names. So the new names only got so much. And so he was given 85,000 records. So his first record out the gate only sells 85,000 copies. And that seems good if you think about the fact that he just sold out his record stock, but it doesn't sound like he knew that at the time. He just seems to think, oh, I only sold 85,000 records, which, you know, at least seeing him talk about it in later interviews, it does seem like he was kind of confused by that, because he knew he was gaining popularity and he expected to sell more than that. And it doesn't sound like they really communicated to him that he only got 85,000 to sell, which is it's weird to impose that restriction and not tell the artist about it, but it seems to have caught him off guard. And so, you know, like I said, initially it's a little bit of an ego check for him. And the other thing that was happening here was that it was during the writer's strike, or the musician's strike. So people weren't allowed to make records anyway. So that even that 85,000, that came on the heels of the strike when it ended. But when he first got introduced to the Victor company, they weren't allowed to crank out records at all because there was this strike going on. So we talked about this in Sister Loretta's episode also, where like it was the two things kind of attacking the music industry at the same time. It was the strike and it was the shellac shortage. And the two things basically, everything came to a screeching halt there in the mid 40s. And, but like I said, they get past it. They crank out this first record. Shellac's still hard to come by. 85,000 copies later, he's feeling a little bit down about himself. Then he goes to Chicago and re-records that song, and that sells 1 million records eventually, which that made more sense. That was like, oh, okay. Like it basically confirmed that number was just because of the shortage and not for a lack of interest. So he, you know, now we're cooking. Now his success is clear, that he's very popular. People love his voice. We are on the road here for Eddy Arnold. And this is where we get some more interesting characters enter the chat here, because 1945 is when Colonel Tom Parker enters the scene. And you might recognize that name because he would go on to get famous for his interactions with Elvis Presley. Now, the things that Tom Parker is famous for. The closer I look at Tom Parker, the less I tend to agree with the general narrative that he was this snake-like manipulative guy. He had some of that in him for sure, but it seems to have benefited everybody he worked with in the long run. Like, did he take a giant cut? Yeah. Did he push his people super hard? Also, yes. Would they have gotten that far without him? Probably not. So I think he gets a little bit more guff than he really deserves here in the telling of history. So Colonel Tom Parker is super interesting. He's born in, I think, 1909, and he's born to Dutch parents in the Netherlands. And he's born as Cornelius van Kutschk, I think is how you say that. And as a kid, he's fascinated by carnivals and shows and things like that. And he's frequently running away from home to get involved with traveling shows and stuff. And in the late 1920s is when he finally, some 20s, early 30s, he manages to sneak into America. So he shows up, no papers, no nothing. Some things describe him as a stowaway. He somehow manages to find himself in America, and he jumps right into carnival work. So he's traveling around all over the place doing carnival shows, and he ends up during this time kind of cutting his teeth in the promotional side of things. And he's learning about, I mean, you can imagine the skills it would require to be a carny in the 1920s and 30s and early 40s, like the pushy sales tactics, the, kind of talking to the public, selling, general sales tactics, and like just getting people to spend money that they didn't really feel like spending at the time. That's a skill set that he sharpens during this time. And I mean, and kind of just whatever quick and dirty tactics he can find, which, like I said, it's the grind. He's learning things at the time. That's all, seems appropriate for the moment. And then in the late 1930s, early 1940s, he transitions more into the artist management side of things, and he does a brief political thing here where he gets involved in a gubernatorial campaign for the Louisiana governor, Jimmy Davis. And Davis wins and honorarily gives him the title of colonel in the Louisiana National Guard. Governor gives him the the honorary title of colonel. And so Colonel Tom Parker becomes his like moniker. Like, he really injects that title into everything he does across all of his management projects in the future. Like that name, Colonel Tom Parker, that people associate with Elvis, the colonel part comes from this gubernatorial race that he helped win in the early 40s. So this is also where he's also simultaneously working with other country artists. I think he worked with Gene Autry at the time, I think was the other big name. But he's starting to kind of cut his teeth in the music world. And here we go. He finds Eddy Arnold, the subject of today's episode. So he kind of goes up to Eddy and kind of engages him and says, okay, how about we do a short run of shows and we'll kind of see how it goes. He gives him a short run of a few shows to see what the booking is like, and it was kind of a trial run, and it goes really well. And in 1945, Colonel Tom Parker becomes Eddy's full-time manager, and he begins to apply all of the tactics that he learned in the Carney days, like all of the crazy whatever, all the pushy tactics, all the scheduling, just push, sell, and taking a giant percentage. I think he was taking 25% of Eddy Arnold's income at the time, and I think the industry standard was like 10. I think that's still kind of somewhere in there. And so he's taking 25%, but he's also shucking and jiving so hard that Eddy Arnold starts to be a really big name and bringing in just a ton of money, which is good for him. I mean, that's, like I said, could they do it without him? Probably not. Was it fair for him to take 25%? Also probably not, but like, who knows what the fair balance is there. because they could have had 100% of nothing or 75% of giant success with Tom Parker. So I withhold judgment for the most part, even though his reputation through history here is not a great one. But anyway, so 1945, Parker becomes Eddie's manager. And like I said, the hits start rolling in here. This is where, after that first record did really well, and then Tom Parker comes along, this is the moment that Eddy Arnold's career just skyrockets here as far as popularity goes. And this is where I go back to respecting the fact that Eddy Arnold had every opportunity to just start doing the rock star thing, just start popping pills and doing coke and drinking a bunch and just doing everything that all these other big names were doing at this stage of the success arc. Like, if you're going to develop a drug problem, it's here as things start to take off and the schedule gets more chaotic and the money starts to flow in. Like, all the temptations of the road are white hot at this stage of the game. Arnold shakes it off and keeps going and maintains this image as a real professional and a gentleman. And that must have been extremely difficult to do, because he's also taking care of a wife, 2 kids, and his mom at the time. So this, for him to maintain his integrity here is something worth noting for sure. So, and like I said, the relationship with Tom Parker, while very productive, is strained pretty quick because Tom Parker gets a little bit greedy in that he tries to do the same thing to other artists at the same time. So it's one thing if you're paying 25% to a manager who is just fully focused on you, pedal to the metal, trying to help you get success, shucking and jiving, making deals, making things happen. Giving him 25% of the money he brings in might be something you can get your head around. If you're giving 25% of your money to a dude who's only giving you half of his attention because he's trying to do the same thing for 2 other artists or even 1 other artist at the time, that starts to rub Eddy Arnold the wrong way, especially because the other artist is Hank Snow, and he's pretty similar to Eddy Arnold, and their record sales kind of compete with each other in a way. So not only is his attention divided, it's divided to kind of a competitor, like not directly, but pretty close. You could describe him that way. If it comes, if you're going to buy 1 record that week, you kind of have a choice between the 2. So that relationship ends professionally. What's weird about it is that they don't seem to have some big blowout over it at the time. It's just Eddie sort of just asserts himself and is like, no, like, I think that this deal is no longer beneficial for me and I want out. And I think Tom Parker ends up, I don't know if he sues him, but somehow they negotiate like a severance package of like $50,000, which is nuts in the 40s. So I think actually that was 1953 is when they split. And so, but that kind of goes to show you how much money they were making. Like, that Eddy Arnold, I think, did pay out that $50,000 and just kind of moved on. And it didn't destroy their relationship. Like, they continued being friends after. And like Eddy Arnold spoke at Tom Parker's funeral when he died. And like, even I saw an interview that he did with, I think it was in 2005 on Ralph Emery that he did an interview. And Ralph Emery asks Eddy Arnold about Tom Parker. And he's like, why did you guys split? And he kind of leans back and he's like, it wasn't for a very good reason. Like, I don't really know. So as an 80-something-year-old man, when he's looking back on this, he kind of just sees it as like, yeah, it must have just been a business decision because it wasn't terrible. And he's like, and I went to his funeral and I gave his eulogy. And so the way the relationship ended seems to have been about the numbers and seems to have been resolved through the numbers. Like, he got paid his severance, he moved on. And it does help that Tom Parker soon thereafter attaches himself to Elvis and they have this skyrocketing success ride. So, but him and Eddy Arnold remained friends after their professional breakup, which, fair enough. And, but even after that, Eddy Arnold, his career here through the 60s is a story of just shrewd business decisions and great music. He's just cranking out hit after hit after hit after hit. I mean, I think it was, it was like 150 songs in a row that charted some like that, not necessarily in the top 10, but that charted and did pretty well. Let's see here. Yeah, so he's back on top in 1965 with What's He Doing in My World. So he'd hit number one before, and then he kind of drops out, and then he gets back in there. He's also doing well, kind of early on here, he's recording for RCA, which had become RCA by this point. And he's starting to become like a really big name. And he's doing things like he's one of the earliest performers in Vegas after, the Flamingo opens. Like Eddy Arnold is one of the first guys in there. And, he's playing Carnegie Hall. He's playing everywhere. He's playing with these big orchestras, and he's playing these just gigantic shows. And it's because he didn't really shy away from the pop sound. So, I mean, people talk about the Nashville Sound, and that Eddy Arnold's a big chunk of that adaptation, and how it wasn't just hayseed, even though he was I think he was known as like the country plowboy or something, but he didn't cling on to that as much. It reminds me of like Buck Owens was kind of the opposite tack, where when Buck Owens did his TV show, he was very hayseedy, very, just overalls, big hat, grass sticking out of his mouth, where Eddy Arnold doesn't seem to have leaned into this at all. Even though he's a country artist, he got out there in a suit, sang very clean, very smooth, very, like he didn't cowboy it up necessarily, even though some of his early stuff is legitimate cowboy music. I mean, you listen to Cattle Call, it's one of the most famous cowboy songs ever written or performed, and that's Eddy Arnold's song, and he does it very cleanly. He's got kind of he's more similar to characters like Bing Crosby and, people of that kind of Frank Sinatra types. He seems to have more in common with them than he does with people like Hank Williams or, and people of that, Minnie Pearl and people like that who were around at the time. Even though he maintained good relationships with everybody in that orbit. But anyway, so he just kind of maintains this success ride all the way through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And he, like I said, the not shocking, but like the pleasantly surprising thing about him is that he never screws it up. He doesn't develop, like his marriage stays intact. His drug habits don't develop. Like if he drinks at all, it's not like a super huge part of his personality. He seems to have kept himself. He never like declares bankruptcy or anything. Even some of the more clean cut characters we've talked about still run into money problems eventually because they spend it all. Not Eddy Arnold. He just kind of did it right and lived into his late 80s. And, there's this not hilarious, but like there's a rather sweet interaction that I found in this interview that I saw him do with Ralph Emery. And like I said, at the time, I think he was 85 or something. And this was the first time that they allowed people to call into the show, and which was kind of a risk because they didn't know how that was going to go. And I think they had imagined that it would be people calling in with questions to kind of move the interview along. And that's not what it was. People just wouldn't shut up about how much they loved him and loved Ralph Emery. So it's all these sweet Southern people calling and being like, I just think you're such a gentleman and your music was such a positive impact on my life. And, just like they forgot to ask any questions. They just poured praise on Eddy Arnold and Ralph Emery, which, while it makes for a kind of weird segment for a TV audience, it is kind of a sweet, the fact that they had that much public goodwill at the time is, that tells you something about the guy. Like if you can imagine if, like if George Jones did that, because George Jones had a TV show into his 70s. If he'd opened the phones up, how much of his audience would be like, you're just such a gentleman and a good, like one lady described Eddy Arnold as like the perfect role model for her son, that she wished he could grow up to be just like Eddy Arnold. People love George Jones's music. Nobody was calling him on the phone to tell him that if they knew him well at all. No shade to George Jones. I mean, his later years, he came around pretty quick, but he had some wild times in there. And like I said, to live your life to where into your 80s, people are just calling to tell you what a great role model you are and what your music did for them, and that you never disappointed them. One person said that. They were like, "You've never disappointed me. You've never let me down." Which, that is like, what a thing to tell somebody in their 80s, at the end of their musical career, because by then he couldn't really perform very much. Another thing about him is that he was the youngest person to be inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. He was inducted in 1966, and he doesn't die until, 2008 or 2000? Yeah, 2008. So he dies like right before his 90th birthday, which I think pneumonia. But so when he's 90 years old, he's been in the Hall of Fame since he was 66. So he spent the last third of his life as a Hall of Fame member, which is pretty cool. And yeah, and like, and right there in 2005, that like part of that interview that I watched was he was kind of on a promotional tour for his 100th album, which included the version of Cattle Call that LeAnn Rimes sings on. And that's a cool tie-in, because LeAnn Rimes, as she was coming, she was just a teenager, I think, at the time when she recorded that. And she had picked it because she liked it. And then I think her producer was somehow tied to Eddy Arnold. And he was like, "Do you want to meet the guy that did the original?" And LeAnn Rimes is like, "Yeah, sure." And sure enough, they introduce him, and then they, one invites the other to be on the record. And here we go. There's this version of Cattle Call with LeAnn Rimes and Eddy Arnold, which he was old at the time. I mean, I think he was already in his 80s when that happened. Late 70s, early 80s, something like that. But yeah, like I said, he's just this cool, like, character that you can kind of look at as a guy that did it right. And he rode the technology all the way from early infancy in the shellac days to selling CDs. Like, he's one of the few artists that I've found that lived long enough to put out music in those three mediums. He made it from the shellac records into vinyl, into the CDs. I mean, and then in 2008, he's into the digital world here. Like, he's, like, we had MP3 players, back then. And so he, this one guy's career, that's 4 modes of putting music out that this guy survived and succeeded in. So just a cool story, and a cool cornerstone of the country music scene. And yeah, it's cool. I think he doesn't get enough credit for doing it right. I think that's a good, inspiring character to grab onto. And it just seems like he was just a super nice guy, just nice, hardworking, talented, good vocalist, willing to help people out where he could. And yeah, that's Eddy Arnold. So thank you guys for listening, and we'll see you next week.